Good morning. Welcome to day 13, the Quantum's Liberty DeStress Countdown series. We're doing 16 weeks. Good morning, buddies. There's your water. Hope this day is finding you well. Today on the phone with me, we have Audrey Elizabeth from Saskatchewan, Canada. And we also have Elizabeth Audrey. They are cousins, and she lives in Oklahoma. So today, what we're going to be tapping on, these cousins have mayflower ancestry. And so Audrey and Elizabeth both had interesting things to talk about. Let's tap, because we're doing a DeStress series. We're doing a 16-week countdown to a point whereby the coronavirus pandemic was going to be a little bit less in the United States, according to a critical care class taken 16 weeks ago, almost 12 weeks ago, I guess. So we're getting there. We have 14 weeks ago. So we're getting there. We have 2 more weeks, and then we might have to start again. So the girls are 8 years old, and 7. They were both born the same year, and mom in Oklahoma is married to one of the people who works in policy in Oklahoma. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the policy in Oklahoma. And one thing that we were also going to talk about, because Audrey and Elizabeth up in Saskatchewan, the mother and dad are part of the First Nation tribe. And so what they are doing, the tribe is actually split. So we're going to be talking about some things that the girls were talking about. They have families who are interested in policy, right? And their policymakers are actually split in the different nations. So there are people who are trying to say, well, what do we actually have to do in health and keep on tapping, girls, because these are excellent questions that we were talking about for several hours. And one of the things that the First Nation is split about is, so we're tapping on the karate chop point right here. And what we're doing is we're going to be tapping, and this will slow down the firing of the neurons to the amygdala, which is your fight flight, which makes you run from danger, right? So what we want to do when we're tapping on this point is we are going to be keeping the oxygen in the prefrontal cortex, where we can think about the next best thing to do. Now, the other thing, that when the neurons fire to the amygdala and make the oxygen get sent to the arms and legs to run from danger, the other thing that happens in the brain is that the capillaries constrict 70%. So what we want to do is, when we're tapping, we leave those capillaries nice and open so we can actually think about the next best thing to do. And the thing that tapping does too, we're sort of tapping a little bit on the inside of the eye point. The other thing that the tapping does is that it helps us to reduce the stress, so we can actually feel, and then we're doing outside the eye, just follow along with me. So we can actually feel inside of us what our energy is telling us. So we can actually feel if we're having sadness in our heart or fear. Then we're doing collarbone point, and then the underarm point, and top of the head point. So we can actually, when we're tapping, what we're doing is we're tapping on the stressors. And when we tap on the stressors, then we release those stressors, right? So they're not being held in our bodies and in our minds. And then we can actually feel what needs to be done. And because the oxygen is in our prefrontal cortex, we can think about the next best thing to do. So this can be really helpful when situations occur, which commonly they do, especially in healthcare, and with the coronavirus, which we're going to talk about, because that was a little bit stressful for the girls that their parents are going through some differences in opinion. Up in Saskatchewan, so the problem is that some of the First Nation tribe is saying that we want to have our land back, right? So, and they did some magnificent things. They're thinking about climate justice. So they're thinking about, well, we're getting these massive flooding, and we're getting fires, and we're getting hurricanes, and just massive destruction based on the climate. So what the scientists are saying, and the First Nation has many scientists who are researching what they need to do to protect the animals, and the people are protected secondarily when we protect the animals and we protect the fish and we protect the land. So what's happening is when we're using so many fossil fuels, scientists are telling us this, we are both having an increase in respiratory problems because the fossil fuels release gases that are very dangerous for us, and they're also increasing the amount of carbon imprint on the Earth. And so we're having these massive climate changes that are causing billions and trillions of dollars of damage. So the First Nation is divided right now. A small number is saying, we're really mad at, right, this is what they were saying, we're really mad at President Joe Biden, right? They don't like Chief Joe because he stopped the Keystone Pipeline. So some of the First Nation people are really mad, and they have to look at what they're mad at. So we do the tapping, right? And if we can do the tapping, then they can look inside their hearts, right? And hold their heart like it's a little baby and say, well, what are you really mad at? And what they're mad at is that the jobs that the pipeline produces are going to be reduced. So that is going to be a problem for the economy. But what they're looking at is that they're not looking at the whole big picture, right? And this also happened in Oklahoma, right, sweetie? But we'll stay in Saskatchewan right now, First Nation. So with First Nation, when we have circle justice, like what Native American, the Native American circle justice people say, whatever you do to the animals, you do to yourself. Remember that, right? And that's from Touching Spirit Bear by Ben Mikaelsen, which you'll read when you're older, probably in high school, junior high school. So when the First Nation people heard that the Keystone Pipeline, which carries fossil fuels for automobiles, was stopped by President Biden, they're very pissed. So, and then the other thing that they didn't look at is that the science, if you look at the whole big picture, the science will show us that when we're using these fossil fuels, those are going to increase the risk of all the climate problems that happen, and that costs a lot of money. So, so there are people in First Nation, also in Saskatchewan, who are saying that we're going to take the land back, and they've done some beautiful things like restoring 1,200 acres, I think, in Big Sur, and also the Klamath River dams. They opened them up so that the fish tributaries flow beautifully again. So what William Bruce Cameron said was interesting in '63. He said, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And this is kind of an interesting thing that happened, right, with your parents in Oklahoma. The House decided for coronavirus that they're going to open up this Families First Coronavirus Response Act, right? And so everybody in the entire, so that went through the House. It was started in the House, and that's where your parents are. And then also it went up to the Senate. But in Oklahoma, the two senators were in Oklahoma. They were one of the only two, they were two of the only 8 senators who said, no, we don't want to have that Response Act. And what was happening was that they weren't tuned in to the evidence-based practice that medicine is based on. So what they did was they said, no, we don't think that we need to have 10 days given off if you get COVID. And we don't think that you ought to have free testing for coronavirus. And we don't think that you ought to have expanded unemployment insurance either. We think that you ought to be able to do it on your own. And they went and they bought $2 million worth of hydroxychloroquine that President Trump said works against the coronavirus. So now they have $2 million worth of hydroxychloroquine sitting in Oklahoma, and they don't know what to do with it. So anyway, the Congress, representatives, the 4 of those guys are, like you said, your families are a little upset about that. But there's a Japanese proverb. It says, fall 7 times, get up 8, right? And so we're going to tap on, let's tap on resistance to accepting, right? So sometimes the science is really, really important to look at. We have these tools that help us, like for Oklahoma, some of the tools that would have been really effective was to listen to the science. Those 2 senators, even though they were thinking, well, it's bad for small business, right? They were thinking about small businesses and protecting them. But they were not thinking about like the long term, which is that the people, the citizens in the state of Oklahoma, even though the small businesses would be open, they would be getting sick. And so in the long run, that would not affect the small businesses well. So something that would have been really nice for them to do would be to they could have researched. There's a whole list and a library. It's spelled COCHRANE. And that library, Cochrane Library, has wonderful data that is usually, most always, peer-reviewed and evidence-based, and it's really good data of all the medical data. So they could have connected to some organizations and think tanks that actually work on both sides of the spectrum, because it's important in healthcare to have both sides of the spectrum for conservative and also liberal views. So these are 2 organizations that are primarily either conservative or liberal, but they also have data for where you can actually see the data from both views. So one of them is the, and this is the conservative organization, but they do have people from both sides of liberal and conservative, and this is called the American Enterprise Institute. www.aei.org. And the liberal one is called Center for Public Policy Priorities, or Americans for Democratic Action, and www.adAction.org, or www.cppp.org. So those guys represent two extremes of the ideological continuum, right? So we can look at the Cochrane Library and see what the data says about hydroxychloroquine, and see that the science was saying that it doesn't work for the coronavirus. So now they have all of this, but well, hopefully they'll hold on. I guess they have to hold on to it, and maybe they'll need it at some point. We don't know if, like, maybe these variants will need it. So what's really important is to look at science, because even though you can have two extremes, right, on the continuum, the bottom line is we want humanity to thrive. And that's kind of what tapping does, is it helps us to be able to keep our oxygen in our brains, right, and communicating well with all parts of the brain, so that we can think about the next best thing to do. So the girls are going to be doing some research and learning about how they can keep the fish streams healthy, and how we can also to develop good policy to keep people healthy, because not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. Let's see, so let's tap on any resistance that we have inside of us to accepting exactly where we are right now with health. So tune in and imagine yourself in radiant, lovely health, right? So we're going to put the tongue on the bottom of the mouth and let it just rest there. Drop it down into the bottom of your mouth so the tongue is just resting. And while the tongue is resting there, take 3 deep breaths in and out, and imagine yourself in radiant, vibrant health. So the tongue is resting. Inhale.